Hello, my name is Roger Berkowitz, and I'm the founder and academic director of the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. Thank you all for joining us. This is the virtual reading group. We're reading, continue to be reading Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism. We're two-thirds of the way through, folks. It's a big book. I applaud you all for sticking with it. And we're getting now to what for many people are the payoff chapters. These are the chapters that actually describe totalitarianism, which is what I think a lot of people are interested in. The earlier chapters are important. They set the tone. They look at these elements. But now we begin to really look at the phenomena itself. And it's often important to remember that Arendt comes out of this German school of thinking called phenomenology. It's an attempt to understand the things themselves, the phenomena. And here is going to be a combination of looking at the phenomena of totalitarianism. She's going to make a very particular argument about what totalitarianism is. On the one hand, it's about terror, and especially in in chapter 12 on totalitarianism and power, we're going to get a strong phenomenological exploration of what terror is. And as part of that, then in the extra chapter, chapter 13, which is added in the second edition of the book and then carried on ideology and terror, we're again going to explore this idea of terror, but add to it the idea of what she calls the basic experience that underlies all totalitarianism, which is loneliness. And for those of us who've been reading this book together, we know that this idea of homelessness, rootlessness, atomization, and loneliness have been essential ideas that carry throughout. And as we get to the end of the book, they will become even more important and more central. The way this last section of the book on totalitarianism is structured can be seen closely by the definition she gives on page 323. I know I talked about this in the introduction, but I find it to be really important and helpful, so I'm just going to repeat it. So on 323, after a space in the text, which is rare, she says, totalitarian movements are mass organizations of atomized, isolated individuals. There we get it. If you can understand that sentence, you really will understand the book. So on the one hand, totalitarianism is a movement. And chapter 11, the next chapter, which we'll read next week together, presents totalitarianism as a movement. And we'll explore what that is. They're movements of mass organizations. Well, today in this chapter, we look at what a mass is and what the masses are and what therefore a mass movement might be. And then there are organizations, and that idea of the organization of a mass movement is the topic of chapter 12, Totalitarianism and Power. So masses are dealt with in chapter 10, movements in chapter 11, and organizations in chapter 12. And then the atomized, isolated individuals carry throughout. We're going to get a lot of that in this chapter, actually in all of the chapters, but then they come to the fore in chapter 13, ideology and terror. And so that's a quick way to understand the way this entire section on totalitarianism fits together. There are two parts to the section on the classless society. The first is called simply the masses, and it's one of the I think it's one of the richer phenomenological chapters in the book, and yet one of the ones that I think is most problematic. What are the masses is a very tough question. Arendt, I think, has an idea for them. She wants to separate the masses from the mob. And I think a lot of that idea is fleshed out in her work and meaningful. And yet there's no doubt that it's a difficult idea, and what are the masses? I mean, is it a derogatory word or not? Um, it's one we have to take seriously because she uses it. It's important, but we want to be careful in using it. Careful in the sense that I think it's not entirely, there's not going to be one way to sort of say, here is the mass and have it answered. So we just have to be, it's an attempt to understand it, but it's never going to be perfect. The second part of the chapter is on the mob, or the temporary alliance between the mob and the bourgeoisie, not the mass. And so understanding the relation between them is important. In a short way to say it, I'll try and say it. The mob is the lower class. The mob is the people who want power and feel excluded from power through the institutions of society. The mass is something very different. The mass is not the lower class. The mass can be part of the lower classes. It can be part of the bourgeois class. It can be part of the elite. It's the detritus of all the classes. And it's the part of those classes that feel not just that they are not in power, but they feel alienated, separated, and divorced from society. They feel as if the society is not their own. They feel lonely. And it's the loneliness of the masses, the atomization of the masses, where they feel outside. They're the politically neutral people who don't usually vote, who say, who do I care? Both parties suck. Both parties are not going to help me. They help the poor, or they help the middle class, or they help the bourgeoisie, or they help the elite, but they don't do anything for me. It's these disillusioned, lonely outsiders that are who she calls the masses. And so we're going to try and understand that. I thought it would be good to just take a look on the first 4 or 5 pages at some of the claims she makes that I think are actually quite interesting. Let me remind you that if you have questions, you can write them in the chat box. So on page 305 to 306, the first few pages, she talks about the leaderships of the leaders of these totalitarian movements. And what she says is these leaders are not understandable unless we understand the relation to the masses, or the social world that they come out of. And it's interesting that a lot of this work is done in the footnotes. And so I want to pay attention to some of the footnotes. So on page 305, the first page, she talks about the fascination that Hitler exerts, right? And she says that the fascination is a social phenomenon, and the fascination Hitler exercised over his environment must be understood in terms of the particular company he kept. Society is always prone to accept a person offhand for what he pretends to be, so that a crackpot posing as a genius always has a certain chance to be believed. We can talk about the relevance of this to the modern situation. But the point is that for a people who are already feeling outsiders, who feel lost, and who don't feel comfortable making strong judgments, who don't know how to make strong judgments, they believe someone to be powerful and serious because the person has convictions and sticks by them. So she says, someone who not only holds opinion but also presents them in a tone of unshakable convictions will not so easily forfeit his prestige, no matter how many times he has been demonstrably wrong. It's an amazing insight, and it's one that's clearly relevant for what's going on in the world today in the United States, but also elsewhere. You can be demonstrably wrong and keep repeating yourself, and people think you have character. people think that there must be something there. And this is not new with Donald Trump. I mean, this is something that's been tried by people, throughout history. Certainly in the last 15 or 20 years, it's been widely talked about that presidents or political leaders simply repeat themselves over and over again. And at some point, their lies or their errors are taken seriously as at least claims. I think this is true for all politicians, but it's uniquely true for Donald Trump in a certain way, in that he's willing to do it without any shame, I would say. And I mean by that, for example, his claim that Barack Obama was not a citizen is one he made over and over again for years, despite no proof for it. And then when he finally felt the need to pull back from it, right, during the election, when certain important Republicans sort of insisted upon it, he never said, I lied or I was wrong or I apologize. He simply said, I was right to bring this up. It was an important issue, and now I'm going to let it go. He never said I was wrong. He pivots in such a way that he never admits the wrong. And part of the attraction and fascination of someone like this is the unshakable conviction and the unwillingness to admit that they're wrong. And this comes from the fact that his base, or the base of such a fascinating leader, is in a social world, according to Arendt, in which people don't make judgments, and they don't feel ready to make judgments, and so they basically take at face value claims of seriousness. On the next page, we learn, and this is in the main text, not in the footnote. She writes, this impermanence, namely that the leaders don't last after after they leave or die. Stalin and Hitler are not continuing to be popular figures after they die, she says. And it has to do with the fact that their popularity and their genius, right, comes from what she calls a perpetual motion mania of totalitarian movements, about 5 lies down on 306, which can remain in power only so long as they keep moving and set everything around them in motion. And this is one of the most important things that she really understands, that to be a good totalitarian leader, you have to constantly move. You can't get caught, because you're lying. You're making up new worlds. You're creating fictional narratives and coherent realities. Well, when they get dried up, in the sense that people realize it's a lie, at some point you have to move on. So Trump at some point has to move on from the claim that Barack Obama was not a citizen, and then he goes to a claim that there's voter fraud and 3 million votes against him that were done by illegal aliens. And when that moves on and he needs a new thing, we get Barack Obama wiretapped me, or something along those lines. And what she calls this the extraordinary adaptability and absence of continuity, which she says is the outstanding characteristic of what she calls the totalitarian virus. Now, again, I am not at all making an argument that Trump is a totalitarian. I don't think that's correct at this point. But it is important to see that he is a master at one particular element that Arendt thinks is at the very center, right? An outstanding characteristic of what she calls the totalitarian virus. That doesn't mean he's a totalitarian, but it means he's a master at this extraordinarily adaptability, his ability to keep the perpetual mania machine going, the perpetual motion mania machine going. And I think what's interesting about Trump is that his policies are often quite conservative. He's a nationalist. He wants to limit things. He wants to set limits. And what we know about Arendt is that totalitarianism is associated with things like imperialism, which goes beyond limits and goes to the nation, outside of the nation. And Trump is often actually anti-totalitarian in his policies and in his thinking about the world. right? And so there's an interesting contrast that we encounter between his very limit-oriented and conservative policies and his radical adaptability and unlimited perpetual motion mania in his approach to attacking and attacking other people and keeping a media world alive that is quite unlimited in its approach. On page 309, there are a series of footnotes that I just want to quickly point us towards. She writes about Goebbels, right? Goebbels on the difference between fascism and National Socialism. This is about in footnote 12. And she says that Goebbels writes, fascism is nothing like National Socialism. While the latter goes deep down to the roots, fascism is only a superficial thing. And Himmler says, fascism and nationalism are two fundamentally different things. There's absolutely no comparison between fascism and National Socialism as spiritual ideological moments. And below that, she says that Hitler says that that it began with the fact that in this war, bourgeoisie and revolutionary states are facing each other. It has been an easy thing for us to knock out the bourgeois states, for they were quite inferior to us in their upbringing and attitude. Countries with an ideology have an edge on bourgeois states. And so here what we see is that Arendt is saying that the totalitarian states are radical and revolutionary in their willingness to pursue an ideology that constantly changes and that constantly goes deep and requires people to be loyal to the leader even as they change their opinion, which is very different, she thinks, from fascism, which is a much more state-oriented, limited ideal. And all of this relates to her basic understanding of the masses. And this is what we're trying to get to, which she begins with on 311. And she says that masses are not held together by a consciousness of common interests, and they lack specific class articulateness, which is expressed in determined, limited, and obtainable goals. Masses are not classes, and the masses only emerge at this period of European history, post-World War I, during the Great Depressions, at which there is great economic dislocation, and these people emerge who don't. It's not that they want the workers to unite, or they want particular material or economic goals. They don't have interests that unite them. What unites them is a deep need. The need is to move. I mean, that's the amazing thing. The need is to move. What does that mean, to move? It means to not be bored, to not have time to sit down and think about the desperation of their lives. It means to need deeply, to be constantly excited and see what they're doing as part of a movement that will have great impact on the world and gives them a sense of purpose and meaning at a time in which they are lonely and disenchanted with the world. So they don't have common interests. They are neutral politically. They are indifferent. They're the people who don't usually go to the polls. And this teaches us that there's something true about democracy that we often want to deny, which is that democracies are not about the masses. Most democracies, at their best, 50% of the people vote, more or less. That means half the people, or you want to be a little more generous, a third of the people never vote in a democracy. They're the politically neutral outsiders who have no stake in it. And what that reminds us is that the democracies are still ruled by an aristocratic elite. It might be a larger aristocratic elite than we normally think of, but they're ruled by the people who feel involved in the system. And what Arendt is saying is, in all democracies, there's a large number of people, somewhere between maybe a third and half the people, who just don't participate in the democracy and aren't part of it. And the second point she wants to say is that these people matter, and we never knew that they mattered until the totalitarian age began and leaders emerged who could mobilize these masses for politics. Okay, that's where I'm going to start with today as sort of an intro. I get us going on the masses. I see there's two questions. One by Masha Gessen on the subject of similarities to the present day. I was struck this time on page 309 by the mention of Hitler's unqualified admiration for Stalin. Yeah. So that was near where I was reading some of those footnotes about from Goebbels and Himmler and Hitler. What Arendt sees, and I think this is important both to understand Hitler and Stalin, but also today, and I see what Masha's saying, the admiration that Donald Trump has for Putin, is that totalitarian leaders, as opposed to fascist leaders, see themselves as radical, as revolutionary. They're anti-bourgeois. And she talks later in the chapter about the anti-bourgeois nature of totalitarianism, right? It's not about materialism. It's not about interests. It's about organizing mass, atomized, lonely individuals, to go back to that quote on 323. And so I take that to be your point, Masha. If you want to add anything to it, I'm happy to hear more. Carolyn writes.
That was my point.
Okay. Carolyn writes, should we characterize Trump as a dissembler? Carolyn, you want to say what you mean by that? Because there's no doubt Trump. Let me back up here. Lying is part and parcel of politics, right? Some of you may know Arendt has a famous essay called "Truth and Politics," where she says that truth and politics have never been good friends. Politicians lie for all sorts of reasons, some bad, some good. There are good lies that inspire us. We are all equal. Lies that bring us to a new ideal that we try and actualize. And so it's not this, it's not calling him a liar. We have to say more. He's someone who, as we'll see, and we've started to talk about, but we'll see more in the next chapter as well, is willing to create a fictional reality that has a coherence to it and stick to it and push it, even if it has very little bearing on reality. This is the kind of organized modern lie that Arendt identifies, and is really the first person to identify in this way. And it's a different kind of lie. It's a lie that seeks to give coherence and stability. And for people, and we have to remember, reality sucks, right? I mean, let's see how reality bites, reality sucks. I mean, these are old things. Why does reality suck? Because no matter what we think, whether we're a liberal or a conservative or a Democrat, Republican, communist, neoliberal, whatever it is, reality is complicated, and no ideology that we have ever matches 100% with reality. And so to actually look at reality is to constantly be reminded that our opinions are wrong, no matter who we are. And so for people who are atomized and lonely and feel as if they have been left behind in the world, reality can be a real affront. And the thing that she says, it's more adequate to the human soul, right? It's a great line we'll read next week in chapter 11. It's more adequate to the human soul to be given a coherent fictional narrative that seems to be constant and consistent and perfect than it is to have to deal with the imperfection of reality. And so that's true again for all different people, and all politicians try and, in some sense, do that. But movements excel at that, and that's the point of movements that we'll discuss in chapter 11. So you ask if he's a dissembler, right? That's the Carolyn's question. Yes, and he's a dissembler in the sense that he is willing and is incredibly adept at providing a coherent fictional narrative. Now, let me say, I think Bernie Sanders did that well, just to use another example. The difference is, and this is something to think about as you read next week's chapter as well. At some point, when Bernie Sanders is accused of mistakes or of fictionalizing or of simplifying, he's embarrassed. He can still be shamed. Trump seems impervious to shame. That, to me, is one of his most successful and scary characteristics. To call Trump a hypocrite has no weight for him. I mean, I know Masha's written about hypocrisy. I've written a fair bit about it. We're going to talk about it at the end of this chapter, right? The discussion of Brecht at the end of this chapter is all about how, in a totalitarian world, hypocrisy is no longer seen as a problem. And that's one of Trump's greatest attributes, if he wants to be a totalitarian leader, is his complete imperviousness to the charge of hypocrisy. And so, yes, I think he's a dissembler. I'm not sure dissembler where that goes. Yeah. Can you turn your hello?
I'm trying to. The dissembler is from business, and it's like all successful salesmen are dissemblers in the same way that politicians are dissemblers, and it seems to be acceptable. It seems to be something, but people buy into it because it's a message they want to believe in.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it's a little early, Carolyn, but if you want, we can turn to the discussion of hypocrisy at the end of the book, end of the chapter, which is, to me, one of the most amazing passages in the book. It starts on page 334 and goes through 336. Let's do it, because I love this passage. It's one I've written a lot about and care a lot about. She talks about the attraction of vulgar satire at this period. Right, this is on page 334. What the spokesman of about 10 lines down, what the spokesman of humanism and liberalism usually overlook in their bitter disappointment and their unfamiliarity with the general experiences of the time, is that an atmosphere in which all traditional values and propositions had evaporated after the 19th century ideologies had refuted each other and exhausted their vital appeal, in a sense made it easier to accept patently absurd propositions than the old truths which had become pious banalities, precisely because nobody could be expected to take the absurdities seriously. So here I should apologize. This is one of those examples of a sentence that I wish Hannah Arendt, she sometimes writes sentences that are a little long. They're difficult. But we can make sense of it, I hope. What she's saying here is that in the 19th century, you had all these different competing ideologies: liberalism, communism, nationalism, Darwinism, racism, and what all of these different ideologies, in a sense, which refuted and canceled each other out, what they did in the end is convinced people that there was no one truth, right? This is what's called nihilism, that there is no highest truth, there is no highest value. And the premise of nihilism if you want to put it down to one word besides the definition is there are no highest values. The Umwertung aller Werte in Nietzsche's formulation, the devaluation of all highest values. But what it means is, since there's no highest values, everything is permitted. Everything is allowed. Because if you try and say, this is not allowed, someone says, why not? And you say, because it's immoral. They say, what's morality? It's the rich, or it's the Aryan, or it's the powerful, it's the oppressor. And so all these old verities, these truths, become pious banalities. They become cliches. They're no longer believed. And she says it's actually easier to accept patently absurd propositions, which at least are entertaining and new, than to accept the old and already discredited pious banalities. And so satire becomes the chosen art, because what does satire do? It sends up and shows the absurdity of the pious banalities. We live right now in an age that's satirical. I think we all know that. I mean, the major art forms of our time are satirical, whether it's The Daily Show or The House of Cards or Breaking Bad or all these TV shows that have become popular amongst the elite, especially the elite. They're shows that show politics to be a joke, that show the pious banalities to be banal, and are a kind of what she calls vulgar satire, which doesn't mean they're not good, but it means they laugh at the absurdity of our situation. And so she continues, vulgarity, with its cynical dismissal of respected standards and accepted theories, carried with it a frank admission of the worst and a disregard for all pretenses, which were easily mistaken for courage and a new style of life. So you can think, oh, it's courageous to frankly admit that there's no truth, but she says that's not courage. That's a kind of cynical dismissal of respected standards. And then in the growing prevalence of mob attitudes and convictions, which were actually the attitudes and convictions of the bourgeoisie cleansed of hypocrisy, those who traditionally hated the bourgeoisie and had voluntarily left respectable society saw only the lack of hypocrisy and respectability, not the content itself. So as the mob attitudes emerged, which were really simply the bourgeois attitudes cleansed of hypocrisy. So we have to understand that. It's going to become important. The bourgeois attitude, going back to Hobbes. Remember we talked about Hobbes is the philosopher of the bourgeoisie 200 pages earlier. Look, it's a difficult book. I apologize, but this is why we're here to read it together. You have to go back and read Hobbes and our chapters on Hobbes, chapter 5, in order to understand what's going on here. What Hobbes says is that the bourgeoisie reckons instead of reasons. He calculates. It's all about power. The bourgeoisie is a power-seeking being. And yet the bourgeoisie is a businessman who wants to be respectable. And it's this contradiction between the respectability that a businessman wants and the fact that what a businessman really wants is more money and more power that leads businessmen, bourgeoisie, to be hypocritical. What they have to do is, in a sense, hide their power-seeking beingness behind a respectable veneer. They have to sit on boards and wear nice clothes and look good in public. And yet, behind that, what they're really trying to do is make as much money and amass as much power as they can. And she says this, those who hated the bourgeoisie, right, and had left respectable society, suddenly in satire, we're like, oh, what we see now is an attack on hypocrisy. That's great. What they didn't, and they saw that as honest. They saw that as true. They saw that as transparent. But what they didn't see is that attack was on all values. and thus they didn't look at the content itself. And so the great example that she offers here is on page 335, the next page, in which she talks about Bertolt Brecht's Threepenny Opera, which is the Threepenny Opera. Some of you have probably seen it or read it. And it's worth reading what she says here about the Threepenny Opera, about the reception of it in Germany when it premiered in 1928. The play presented gangsters and respectable businessmen, and gangsters as respectable businessmen, and respectable businessmen as gangsters. So you may remember in the play that the main character, one of the main characters, is this man named Peachum, who organizes the beggars of London, right? And the London beggars go out and beg. He teaches them. He helps them do it. They divide up the areas, and he comes in and he takes a take, right? And he thinks of himself as a respectable businessman, organizing the beggars in a sense. And then there's this other guy, Mac the Knife, who's a mobster. And Peachum thinks, I'm much better. I'm a respectable businessman than this mobster, Mac the Knife. His daughter, Peachum's daughter, marries Mac the Knife, which causes all sorts of agony. And then there's this cop who is on the take to both, And so the idea here is each person thinks they're better than and more respectable than the other. But, Brecht is trying to satirize these folks and say, look, these are all corrupt people. But that's not how the people saw it when they saw the opera. She says the irony or the satire was somewhat lost when respectable businessmen in the audience considered this a deep insight into the ways of the world. So they saw, oh, you're right. We are just mobsters, right? We are just power-seeking people. And that's deep. That's deep. And she says the mob, also liked it because they welcomed it as an artistic sanction of gangsterism. Well, if Brecht's writing about it, then it must be okay to be gangsters, right? I mean, we think of The Sopranos here, right, which is our version of this in the last generation. The theme song in the play, Erst kommt das Fressen, dann kommt die Moral, which means basically first we have a kind of animal or savage eating, and then we create morality after we've devoured what we want. She says was greeted with frantic applause by exactly everybody, though for different reasons. The mob applauded because it took the statement literally. Yeah, the mob can violently do things and then take power and then create morality. Great, we love it. The bourgeoisie applauded because it had been fooled by its own hypocrisy for so long that it had grown tired of the tension and found deep wisdom in the expression of the banality by which it lived. So finally, the bourgeoisie is freed from having to live this hypocritical life and can think, oh yeah, it's okay to be a mobster, a gangster, and then still be respectable. And then here's the third version. The elite applauded because the unveiling of hypocrisy was such superior and wonderful fun. See, they're all a bunch of corrupt losers. Let's tear it all apart and show how it's all broken. The system is broken. The effect, she continues, of the work was exactly the opposite of what Brecht had sought by it. The bourgeoisie could no longer be shocked, right? They weren't shocked by the presentation of themselves as gangsters. They applauded it. It welcomed the exposure of its hidden philosophy, the Hobbesian philosophy, whose popularity proved that they had been right all along, so that the only political result of Brecht's revolution was to encourage everyone to discard the uncomfortable mask of hypocrisy and to accept openly the standards of the mob. That's an extraordinary reading, not only of Brecht's play, not of Brecht's play, but of the reaction to it. She talks about how the old expression that hypocrisy is the vice, is the compliment that vice pays to virtue. What that means is that hypocrisy is the way vice, bad people, act good. It's what keeps them in order. Hypocrisy, she says, is not bad. I mean, an hypocrite is someone who wears a mask, right? We all wear masks. We all, I mean, she said this, she writes a lot about this. And Masha, you'll find this interesting. She'll write a lot about this at the end of the chapter on the social question and on revolution, which is 15 pages on hypocrisy there, which is really rich, deep stuff. And what she says there is, look, we all have a hidden part of our soul, our hidden heart, where we want things and think things that, God forbid, if anybody knew, it would be embarrassing. More than that, it would be terrifying. And in fact, to be a citizen is to wear a mask, right? So we all know that the word persona in Latin, that the Roman word persona was a legal word for the citizen, and it comes from the wearing of a mask. You wear the mask of citizenship. So whatever you are in private, whatever awful ideas you have, when you enter the civic realm, you put on a mask. You're a hypocrite. And that's actually a necessity, according to the Romans, to be a hypocrite. And one of the problems we have in our society right now is that we are constantly denying people privacy, and the privacy to have unsocial or antisocial or bad or racist or sexist or unappealing thoughts in the private world. And when we find that they have them, we immediately take them out and put them in the public. Whereas for Arendt, we need to be able to have those bad thoughts in private. What matters is not that we have these bad thoughts, it's that we know how to act in public. It's actually okay to be a hypocrite for Arendt. This is a long answer to your question, Carolyn, and I apologize, but I think it's one of the most important questions, and I think it's one that really matters today. What Arendt is telling us is we need to understand that some dissembling is not bad.
It's necessary. Society can't work without it.
That's right. That's what she's saying. And the drive today for transparency, right, which is one of those words that we all call for and yet is very dangerous. The drive for transparency is the drive to take away the private and put all of our dark secrets into the public realm. It's a very dangerous drive. It's often made in the name of liberation and equality, because it is true that sometimes the wealthier and more connected have more privacy than the poor. Think about bureaucracies and healthcare and unemployment, where you have to give all sorts of information that people who are wealthier don't have. And so in the name of transparency, you take away their privacy too. But when you do that, you tear away that mask of respectability. So I guess all I'm trying to say is some dissembling is not bad. So you can come back to this if people want. I obviously am very intrigued by these ideas. Masha has another question. In fact, there are countries like Australia where voting is mandatory, and still the process of selecting candidates limits the amount of influences on the masses can have on politics. That's a good point. And there's another idea which some of you may have come across, which has been getting a lot of press in Europe and somewhat here, called sortition, which is a fancy word for the idea of choosing leaders by lot. And some of you probably know that in ancient Greece and in Rome and in many of the middle-aged republics of Italy, some of the officials in different places, different ones, were chosen by lot, and that's now called sortition. And there have been a number of political theorists recently, Bernard Manin, for one, who's French-American, and some others, who've argued that the idea of choosing leaders, political leaders by election, which emerged as the sort of normal way of doing it in the 18th century, is a deeply aristocratic, elitist, and anti-democratic way to choose leaders, because it, in a sense, limits the choice to either the small number of people who vote or the people who select the candidates. and that a much more democratic way to do it is through lottery, so that everyone has a chance to serve at some point. There are, and a number of thinkers are actually trying to think through, okay, you can't just put someone who knows nothing about the environment or science head of the EPA. So where can you and how can you bring in people by lottery? So in the United States, we have sortition in one important area of our politics, which is the jury. The jury is a kind of lottery for judging people. And one could imagine creating other areas in which people were chosen by lottery to be administrators, to govern in some way, or maybe a certain number of lottery chosen people who would be either able to vote in the House of Representatives or be able to advise and critique and offer their opinions in the House of Representatives. These are some of the ideas that some of the current political theorists who are interested in this question are exploring, and it's on that question of how do you make a democracy more democratic than an electoral democracy is today. I see John answered that in Australia, despite mandatory voting, 25% of young people do not register to vote. So, yeah, I mean, there's always the people who just don't care, and we have to accept that. Well, we have to accept it as a fact, and then decide if we want to try and address it or how we're going to address it. Bob Meyerson writes that I raised the problem with her concept of the masses. He has trouble translating this into contemporary American social landscape. Trump supporters do not strike me as isolated masses. The concept of alienated man and women seems very 50s to me, from Camus to Reisman. It captured the imagination of artists and intellectuals. I think we may be barking up the wrong tree if we pin the tail on the masses on the Tea Parters or Trumpeters. All right, to me, this is one of the more interesting questions, and so I'm sympathetic to Bob's point that we shouldn't pin the lonely moniker on simply the Trump's supporters. But I'll push back here. I think we should pin it on also the Occupy Wall Street supporters, the Bernie supporters, and many more people in society. If you accept the polarization thesis, right, that we're living in one of the more polarized times, if you accept that people are embracing fictional realities on both sides, right? So for example, I've been in a lot of discussions recently with people about academic freedom and the right for unpopular speakers to speak on campus. Some of you may have seen that Charles Murray was shouted down and not allowed to speak at Middlebury last week. Milo Yiannopoulos, of course, has had this happen many times. This is now almost a weekly occurrence on the academic world. And, when you try and get into conversations with students who are doing this, they have all sorts of arguments, some better than others, but many completely wrong and many completely afactual. They are living in this defactualized and bubble-oriented and the filter bubble reality as are Trump supporters. Facebook, I mean, if you want to talk about what makes people lonely, I mean, Facebook, the idea that that's your friends is an extraordinary statement. There were a number of studies that came out in the United States between 2005 and 2010. I haven't seen more recent ones, but if anyone knows of these, I'd like to hear about them because it's something I'm writing about and interested in. A number of these studies came out and showed that almost a third of Americans say that they have not one friend that they can confide in. Let me repeat that. A third of Americans have not one friend that they can confide in. Think about that. this is not about Trump supporters, and this is what this is not about a bunch of rednecks from whatever. This is Americans, people who are too busy for whatever reasons, or too self-absorbed, or too caught up in their own lives, or too depressed. I don't know. I mean, look, I don't have all the answers, but I do know that we're living in a time in which people are lonely. I mean, I can tell you, as someone who teaches at a college, the incidence of, or the self-report of depression is just astronomical. And we are constantly being contacted by health services telling us that this student is depressed or that student is depressed. Well, I mean, where does this come from? I don't have an answer to it, but some of us, Bob, I'm sure you've heard of Robert Putnam's work, the Harvard sociologist, who wrote a very famous book called Bowling Alone, and others. And the premise is that the old kind of institutions where people made friendships, had communities, and built up what he calls social capital, a word I don't particularly like, but there it is, and had this kind of had communities of friendship and meaning in their lives, where they went to bowling games or played softball or whatever, that these institutions are being lost, and people are increasingly left on their own without that kind of social capital. One more point to show that I'm not just talking about Trump supporters. In a more recent study done in 2011, I believe, Putnam looked at 7 or 8 cities, urban areas in the United States, and ranked them on the amount of diversity in the city. So how many different religions, races, etc., lifestyles were in the city. And then did a study in the city of loneliness or social capital. And what he found is that in every city, the more diversity there was, the more time people spent alone, the more they watched TV, the less they voted, the less they engaged in community activities, the less social capital they had. Now, what one makes of this is a very, unclear. And I don't want to jump to any conclusions, but it seems to me that the problem of loneliness is not one of a 1950s and ended. It's much bigger than that. And one of the reasons we're seeing ideological inflexibility and the openness to ideological coherence in so many different parts of our lives today, I would suggest, is because of actually an increased sense of loneliness, which makes people less willing and less able to deal with reality.
Let me just respond. Though I live in a rural area, so obviously my experience, or maybe not obviously, is probably different from that of those who live in large cities. And of course, there are isolates out here. But on the other hand, there's a lot of community in many different organizations, especially in the churches. But on the other hand, these isolates, urban, what have you, I don't know that you can say that these are the people who have gone to the Trump rallies. Maybe so, maybe no. I kind of doubt it based on who I see out here supporting Trump. And another thing, and again, I don't know which side of the argument this supports, but 50 years ago when I was in college, there were a lot of people who were depressed, a lot of people going to health services. And so maybe that feeds into your argument that we've been, isolated and lonely for 50 years, maybe 100 years. I don't know, but it's not anything really new. So again, I go back to Arendt's concept of the masses. If I had to explain that concept to people here in my town, they would just, look at me. They wouldn't know what I was talking about.
It's a totally fair point on, I think, both of them. And so let me say, who are the Trump voters? Who are the Occupy Wall Street people? Who are the Tea Party people? It's a hard question for me to answer. I don't think anyone's answered. I mean, Theta Scotchpole, as some of you know, has done some really interesting research on who the Tea Party people were. And I think it's worth looking at that. But I would say that a lot of the Trump voters are people who are finding, I have seen, and I could be wrong, are finding a sense of purpose and meaning in being a Trump voter. Being a Trump voter, being a Tea Partier, is now like what it used to be a bowling league. I think. I could be wrong, Bob, and I'm sure it's not true for everybody. But it's now, I mean, when I read websites, when I go to, PJ Media, conservative websites, or Instapundit, I feel like there's an identity one gets from being someone who reads this website. There's an identity one gets from being a Trump supporter or being a Bernie supporter or this. And in fact, it's so much a part of one's identity that if someone you think is smart disagrees, it's almost an existential crisis, which is why people then start yelling at each other. So I'm not going to insist that it's true for everybody, but I do think that there's something to it. As for the masses, look, I started this saying I have a hard time with this concept and the word. If it were up to me, I wouldn't use the word very much in my writing. I try not to, because I find it to be as you said, a word that most people don't understand, and I'm not sure I do. But what she's trying to describe is a phenomena. Let's remember, she's a phenomenologist. She's trying to describe a phenomena, which is that there are increasing numbers of people who simply feel like they don't belong, who feel that that all the politicians, all the businesses are not talking to them. They feel lonely in the sense of disenfranchised and alienated from the mainstream of the society they see. And there are more of these people, she says, than we think in any democracy. And what we've learned now is that they can be organized, right? They've always existed, she thinks. But A, she thinks there's a lot of them today. And B, we now have the propaganda techniques, and even more so now with social media, to organize those people into a political force. And those people are not a political force that wants to pursue class interests. They're a political force that wants affirmation. And that desire for affirmation is what's so dangerous.
Roger, could I?
Yeah.
I guess when I'm talking about Trump's support, and of course I was astounded by Trump's success. In any event, Trump supporters really are made up of different groups, aren't they? I mean, the ones who voted, some are just always going to vote Republican no matter what. So that's part of it. And then there's the other folks who just voted against Hillary, if it's anti-female or anti-Hillary. So that's a section that really is explainable. But it is that other group here, friends of mine who are middle class. They're not out of work. They're not homeless. They're not, I mean, people who, for all intents and purposes, are apparently more disaffected than I would have imagined myself. And they're religious people. People go to church, Catholics, every imaginable type of person. And by and large, they voted for Trump. And what I still can't explain is, even with his background, even with the history that you knew about him before, and now you know it now, and they're still going along with this insanity. And I know we can use words like depression or disaffected, but it's really inexplicable to me that what's going on. And I'm happy that you've addressed it, and the folks have Bob addressed it. But it's really astounding to me. Again, I talk to him. We're friendly. We never. My wife is more adamant, but I'm more go along, listen, and so on. But I still haven't got a smidgen of understanding about what the justification is for continuing to support what we're dealing with now.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
I'm gonna try and answer that in the next couple of questions, because I'm looking at them and I think they relate to it. So Ruji asks about the difference between mob and mass, and so let me say again, I think that sometimes it's confused. I've tried to say that, but I think there's a coherent difference. The mob is the lower class, and what they want is power. Now, they can sometimes be the middle class and even the bourgeoisie, but what they want is power for themselves. They're not alienated from society. They just feel that the society is not just. The mass are people who don't really care about money or power. What they care about is that they feel that the world has left them, and that what they want is to be taken seriously. They want to be they want to be part of a movement that matters. And what social media and propaganda and ideology allows them to do is to say, we matter, and we are following a leader who's going to show all these elites that we're the people who are in power. I mean, think about how much joy Trump's victory has brought to certain people. I mean, think about how much pain it's brought to some other people. But it's brought joy to people who thought that they were completely outside the mainstream, and suddenly they're the mainstream. And this goes into the next question by Zephyr, which is the relationship between this modern lie and this desire for coherent fiction with the mobility and changeability and adaptability that I talked about back on pages 305 and 306. Because the people in the movement actually don't have so many material aims. Now, again, I'm not saying all Trump voters are like this. I mean, Trump appealed to a wide range of people. There's a certain group of people Trump appealed to who want their jobs back, right? And I don't think that's the people I'm talking about, right? But there are other people who want their health care and want this. But there's some people, and again, I don't think this is the majority even maybe of Trump supporters, but I think it's there. And this goes to Bob's point. I don't think it's all Trump supporters who what they want is to be part of what they call a trumpeter, or be, a part of the Trump movement. And when Trump moves from saying Obama is not a citizen to the size of my crowded inauguration to voter fraud to Obama tapped me, the people who care about immigration or care about jobs say this is a distraction. They're not interested in that. So we might ask, why is Trump doing this? And I think this goes to Zephyr's question, and it goes to these things on page 306, that part of what he's offering, not to all his supporters, but to some of them, is the perpetual motion mania of totalitarian movements, which can remain in power only so long as they keep moving and set everything around them in motion. This extraordinary adaptability. So later in the chapter on page, really near the end, on pages 335 to 336, she's talking about what appealed to the elite. This is on 336 near the bottom. What appealed to the elite was radicalism as such. Now that's the elite. But what she's saying is that there's a certain desire for radicalism as such, unrelated to what it's going to accomplish. And that desire for radicalism as such, that perpetual motion, which is what we're going to explore in the next chapter on movements, is part of the attraction of the totalitarian leader. That what they offer is a feeling of constant motion. There's a I forget where it is. We may have talked about it last week. She cites in a footnote somewhere a discussion of a Russian communist who goes to Paris, and in Paris he is struck by how boring Paris is. And what she says about this is that what the Russian Stalinist world had given this communist was a sense that politics was about constant motion, was about constantly moving and always having an enemy. And the Nazis constantly criticized Weimar as the Systemzeit, the time of the system, which was boring and slow and plodding. These are languages, these are words that I think you can all hear in today's discourse. One of the things Trump offers is entertainment, is excitement, is a sense of speed. And there's no doubt that that is a large part of the attraction of his movement to the kind of person Arendt is calling a mass. That is not all of his supporters. Ian is asking us to look at a sentence on page 324 where she says, total loyalty is possible only when fidelity is emptied of all concrete content from which changes of mind might naturally arise. Not only does it seem incredibly powerful, it's exactly what I was just talking about, I believe. The point is that, again, not for all Trump supporters and not for all Bernie supporters, and not for all Occupy people and not for all Tea Party people, but for a large number of people, their attraction to the politics of a movement is not attraction to what it will accomplish, but to being part of it. And only then, when it's emptied of concrete content, can you have total fidelity to a leader. So I have a piece that's going to be coming out in the LA Review of Books next week, in which I argue that there is no more important and paradigmatic moment of the campaign than when Trump got up and said that I have the most loyal followers in the world. I'm running a movement, and I could walk down Fifth Avenue and shoot someone, and I wouldn't lose my followers, my supporters. He was right. I mean, he was right. And people poo-pooed him. But that was one of the few points in the election when he told the truth. Told it as clearly as you can. And it's because, now let's say he would have lost a lot of his supporters. He would have lost the people Bob Meyerson is talking about, right? He would have lost the people Pat is talking about, the good people who are trying to accomplish something. But there's a certain part of his support, it seems to be about 30 or 40% of the American public, who seem to be with him no matter what he does. And that's important for us to recognize. That's what she means by the masses. Those are the masses. Those are the people who aren't in this for concrete, goods. They're also the people who, are not in it for self-interest. They're people who are willing to sacrifice themselves for the movement, right? That's a wonderful, point that she makes. The masses are actually people willing to sacrifice themselves. They're not selfish. And that's one of the attraction that the masses hold for the elite. So she talks about the German war, during the German war, and she talks about Ernst Jünger and Thomas Mann and Max Scheler and many of these writers who are very, dignified German writers, who had disgust for bourgeois society. This is on page 328 to 329. And what they found ennobling about World War I, and a lot of these people wrote books praising war and praising the importance of war, was that war was one of the last opportunities in a decadent bourgeois culture where people could sacrifice themselves in a way that was considered noble. And this war ethic, which gave glory to the cog. Ernst Jünger writes a very famous and controversial book, Der Arbeiter, the laborer, the worker, about how in the new era, genius was no longer what mattered, and what mattered, the great people, were the masses who could become a cog and give themselves to a movement. And we talked about T.E. Lawrence when we talked about chapter 5, the bureaucracy chapter 8. Chapter 7 on race and bureaucracy, where we talked about T. Lawrence, and that what he did was lose his I-ness, his individuality, and step into the stream of history. And he says in one of his books, the only thing that distinguished me from others is that I stepped into the right stream. Right? This idea of glorifying the cog, the mass man, who simply sacrifices their bourgeois individuality to become part of a movement, was glorified during the early 20th century by a lot of these writers. And what they offer is loyalty to the leader for whom they will sacrifice everything. And there's a long tradition now of this idea of sacrificing oneself to a movement. And that's without a doubt part of what Arendt is talking about, the new mass man. There's a kind of glory to it, and that's what attracts the elite and the intellectuals to movements. They see this selflessness and they respect it because they're so disgusted with bourgeois selfishness. Jack writes, doesn't nihilism arise because of the contradiction between the most widely held fiction, religion, and emerging redescription of reality, science? And doesn't that contradiction continue to inform the isolation and alienation of individuals in the current environment? I don't think so. I think that's the critique of religion is only one small part of nihilism. Nihilism goes on from critiquing religion to critiquing all authority, including traditional authority, but now even scientific authority. Even science is now considered to be simply one way of finding truths and not to offer a truth. There are all sorts of critiques of science as being socially and culturally related to a certain class. And there's also critiques of science which see it as committed to an idea of objectivity, which doesn't exist. So nihilism destroys all truths and all claims to authority, not just science. Nihilism is an unstoppable monster, and one of the challenges for thinkers like Nietzsche and Heidegger and Arendt, who all three see this about nihilism, and not just them, but they're three that are worth talking about, is to try and think how to find common meaning in a world, in a post-metaphysical and a post-truth world. And for Nietzsche, there's something about creating new values through a great leader. For Heidegger, it's about the communing with being and setting oneself under the call to being. And for Arendt, it has to do with politics, with plurality, with opening oneself to a plurality in which common judgments are possible, and the creation of non-metaphysical new truths might emerge that would be cultural, that would be accepted by persuasion and example. So these are different approaches that these kind of post-metaphysical thinkers take to the problem of overcoming the destructiveness of nihilism. Masha asks, on the subject of hypocrisy and private public, there is also the recurrent problem of racism versus racist speech or action. The standard defense, I am not a racist, goes to what a person is privately, and this is the reason the accusation of racism is so painful. It addresses the private essence rather than the public behavior. This is, to me, one of the most important and difficult questions of our particular moment. I remember, you guys probably remember the name, I'm going to blank on his name, but there was a man who owned a basketball team. And he had a biracial girlfriend, and he was an older man and she was a younger woman, and she was hanging out with Magic Johnson and other people, and they got on a cone, and he said, look, my friends don't like you hanging out with Magic Johnson and other players, and black players especially, could you stop? And she recorded him. And he said to her, things like, look, I don't care if you do it. I don't care if you sleep with them, as far as all I care. But my friends do, and I'm asking you to stop. Anyway, she released these recordings. And, he was accused of saying racist things, which he certainly did. And he had to sell his team. Well, there's a lot of questions to ask about that. This was a private conversation between a man and his girlfriend. Should she have recorded it? What kind of trust is that in a relationship? Should she have released it? Should we care what he said in a private conversation? I don't want to reveal too much about my life, but I've said things to my wife and said things to some of my friends that would not stand the scrutiny of public life. I imagine most of you have as well. Now, maybe you're not. Maybe you're one of those people who just doesn't have those dark parts of you. But I do, and it would be very embarrassing and difficult for me if those were put out in the open. So should we care if people have prejudices? So I'm going to introduce a change in the language for Masha's question. You can push back on it, Masha, or someone else if you want. I make a distinction. We talked earlier in the reading group when we read the chapter on race thinking and racism, between race thinking and racism, between prejudice and racism. And what I will say is that racism is a public embrace of institutional reasons that put one race above the other. Prejudice is an expression of judgment, prejudgment, that I think this about Jews, or I think this about white men or white women, or black men or black women. And prejudice is an opinion. It can be wrong and it can be painful, but it's different from racism. We are all prejudiced. You couldn't live without being prejudiced. We all have prejudgments. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try and overcome some of our prejudgments and prejudices that are more problematic than others. In fact, Arendt says in one of her books that that's one of the main activities of politics, is to overcome certain prejudgments. But it can't be to overcome all prejudices. And a lot of the anti-racism discourse today sometimes acts as if the goal is to get rid of all prejudices, to make all people in public and private, have no prejudices. That's impossible. And it's not even desirable. I think, when someone says that Donald Trump is a racist, which you've heard a fair bit, or that he's an Islamophobic person, what does that mean? Or an anti-Semite. And here's a man with, Israeli kids and Jewish kids and Jewish grandkids. What does it mean to call him an anti-Semite or an Islamophobe? Are you talking about his policies, or are you talking about his personality? And John McWhorter, the great professor at Columbia, has written a number of essays in which he said, look, a lot of the presidents who've done the most for the African American community, and we can just stop naming it one, Lyndon Johnson, was a racist at home. And yet he understood the need to make the country less racist in public. So, it's not entirely clear that we should care so much about people's private feelings about race. And yet we do. I'll stop there. I don't know if there are comments. I know these are controversial questions, and I don't want to cheer.
Well, you have seen some anti-Semitism recently, whether it's condoned by Trump or not. It's been a fact of public discussion.
Absolutely, Pat. And let me say, he was slow to do it, but he finally did in his speech to Congress directly condemn that. But let me point something out that I haven't seen pointed out anywhere, which is that in the same sentence that he condemned the anti-Semitic violence and threats against the Jewish institutions, he mentioned the 2 people killed in Kansas City. But he didn't mention that the 2 people killed in Kansas City were Indians from India, and that they were killed because they were thought to be Muslim. So he didn't do what he needed to do, in my opinion, which is directly confront the anti-Muslim violence that was committed, to some extent, in the name of his movement. He has to come out and say that. He did it in a way that, for people who, like me and maybe many of you, who knew that the people who killed in Kansas City were Indians who thought to be Muslims, we saw, oh, he checked off that box. But for other people, please mute your mics, folks. For other people, he didn't mention the word Muslim. And they may not have known that the people killed in Kansas City were Muslim or thought to be Muslim. And that's really dangerous. To me, the one ideology that Bannon and some of Trump's aides have that is truly potentially dangerous in the racist way is anti-Islamic or Islamophobia, whatever you want to call it. And I don't think that Trump shares it, but he's willing to use it, right, in ways that are very dangerous. And so let's.
I took that to be a fact. What he's contributing to is his general idea of fear. The reason he doesn't, doesn't, as you mentioned, he tries to imply it's Muslim, this fear of Muslim invasions and Mexican invasions, and this whole atmosphere of fear in order to accumulate power. And then once we take care of the enemies outside, which, we all know have ISIS and, we know Russia's trouble and we have enemies outside, but they're not overwhelming our country. And then he'll get back to focusing on the enemies inside, the press, judiciary, academia, whatever. I think that the things he leaves out is because he wants to maintain this fear, this atmosphere of fear, which will allow him to accumulate power. That's my idea anyway.
Mm-hmm. Let me just take a look at 2 questions because we're almost out of time. SCB asks, what can explain the fascination with someone who pivots on their own position? And Kim asks, the elephant in the room, about immigration and political correctness. Paul asks, are not the groups across the country that are organizing in opposition to Trump also a mass in Arendt's usage? There's a counter movement. So I've tried to say that I think that the mass, not all Trump supporters are masses and not all of the counter movement are masses, but I think that there are people who are finding meaning and identity in both the movement and the counter movement, and I think that is part of the mass. The elephant in the room being immigration and political correctness, I think is important. I taught a course on immigration and Trump yesterday with my colleague Joel Perlman, and one of the things that I learned that I didn't know. I knew, we went through all the different anti-immigrants debates in United States history, and there were many of them. And some of you, I'm sure, know that from 1924 till 1960, we let in almost no immigrants in this country. But none of the populist movements that emerged in the United States in the 19th and early 20th centuries were anti-immigrant. I was surprised by that. I didn't know that. And so the new populism in Europe and in the United States is so deeply anti-immigrant. And I don't know entirely what to make of that, but I think it is one of the elephants in the room, Kim. So I think that we have to understand that. I think we read a lot of Bannon quotes in this class yesterday about immigration, and also some Jeff Sessions quotes. And I think one of the things I learned is that there is a deep, deep sense of nationalism. The sense that they think that being an American doesn't mean just being part of an economic system. It means being an American, and that they want that to mean something. And they feel that the immigration policies are challenging that. Now, why is an interesting question, what that means, etc. They don't want to cut out immigration at all. We have to remember that, but they want to limit it, and they want to focus it on Judeo-Christian immigrants. By the way, prior to World War II, immigration was always tried to be limited to just Christian. And it was during World War II that the rhetoric changed to Judeo-Christian. And I think the challenge is today to make it Abrahamic, if you want to include Muslims. Or if you don't even want to include others and you don't want to do that, we have to come up with another idea. But the question, there's a real conflict between those who think that America has a national and particularly religious identity, like Bannon does, and I think Trump does, and those who think that America is a nation without any particular religious or ethnic identity, and that's a battle that's being fought. And political correctness. Look, I think I've said this a number of times. I think one of the reasons Trump is so popular is he's willing to say politically incorrect things. I think that's one of the main reasons for his support. And the truth is, political correctness has, for many people, become nonsense and become a threat to their common sense view of the world. Whether we talk about microaggressions or we talk about the fact that you're not allowed to have Charles Murray give a speech, and that free speech doesn't mean anything, and that free speech is a cliche, and that what matters is power, and that we shouldn't let people we disagree with speak, which is the kind of politically correct argument that students are making now to not allow people to speak, is for many people a threat to their very idea of what it means to be a Democrat in America. And so I think that the extremism of the politically correct argument has alienated a lot of people from what they see to be the establishment of America, and has led them to want someone who's willing to speak the truth to that. And I think, again, if one thing Trump spoke truth to, besides that he could kill someone, it was that he constantly was politically incorrect. He was clear on that, and I think that was one of the main reasons he won. And we have to take that seriously. The last point that has to be made is that Harold Bush is simply wrong. I never rooted for the Yankees, and I won't let that go. So I hope this was enlightening. We're going to be talking a lot more about some of these issues, especially around movements and coherent fantasies and coherent fictions in the next class on the totalitarian movement. So enjoy reading Hannah Arendt, and I look forward to continuing to talk with you. Thanks very much.